Hey, what's going on, guys? Victor Chambers here, back with another video. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. On this channel, I provide you with tips, strategies, and advice to empower you on your real estate journey. Consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting that notification bell so you'll be notified when I upload brand new content. In this video today, we're going to talk a little bit about agency. What is agency? What types of agency are there in the real estate industry? I want to talk a little bit about this because what I find in that talking to clients is that this is probably one of the most misunderstood things by consumers and by the public when it comes to how real estate agents actually work. And so I just kind of want to clear the air and provide some clarity on what agency is and what it means, how we work as real estate agents and in the different capacities, and what our responsibilities are as real estate agents in various types of transactions. In the state of New Jersey specifically, and probably similarly in other states, we have what's called a consumer information statement. The consumer information statement is designed to be presented and signed by a client that we're working with in the first conversation or in the first meeting where we begin to talk to them about buying, selling, or renting a home. It's intended to outline the different types of agency and basically say how you intend to work with them as a consumer. And in that document, the consumer information statement outlines 4 types of agency: the seller's agent, a buyer's agent, a disclosed dual agent, and a transaction broker. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what each one of these actually means. But first, what we have to understand is that each one of these agency types imposes certain legal responsibilities that we as agents have to our clients that we're working with. So first, let's talk about the seller's agent. The seller's agent works only for the seller. The seller's agent has legal and fiduciary responsibilities to the seller. What are these fiduciary responsibilities? They include reasonable care, undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and full disclosure. In a real estate transaction, when an agent has defined themselves as working with the seller, they do not work for the buyer, and thus they do not represent the buyer's interests. They represent the interests of the seller. However, it's important that real estate agents, no matter what role they're in, they must always act honestly and fairly with all the parties they're dealing with in the transaction. In addition to the consumer information statement, the seller's agent is authorized to work for the seller and on behalf of the seller through what is called a listing agreement. If a seller desires their property to be listed on the multiple listing service and marketed by a specific broker, they will have a listing agreement in place with an agent, a seller's agent, that defines all the responsibilities of both the seller, the broker, and the agent in the transaction. Now, let's go to the other side and talk about a buyer's agent. A buyer's agent, again, works on behalf and in the interest of the buyer. Their fiduciary responsibilities, again, include reasonable care, undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and full disclosure. And again, a buyer's agent must act fairly and honestly with all parties involved. And similar to a seller's agent, a buyer's agent must be careful not to make any misrepresentations regarding the physical condition of a property or the history of the property, because this information can have a material impact on a transaction. Just as a seller and a seller's agent have what's called a listing agreement, a buyer and a buyer's agent may have what's called a buyer agency agreement. This is often an exclusive contract, and in many cases just a formality to define the relationship between a buyer and a buyer's agent for a certain length of time. Third type of agency I want to discuss is a disclosed dual agency. Now, this is where things get a bit fun, and perhaps I'll dedicate a whole nother video to talking about disclosed dual agency, but for the purposes of this video, I'll be brief. A disclosed dual agent is an agent that works on behalf of the seller and the buyer, but they must obtain written consent from both parties so that each party and everyone knows that the agent is working on behalf of both the buyer and the seller. So again, before acting in this capacity, an agent must provide written disclosure to both parties that they're working as a disclosed dual agent. So what does this look like in real life? Well, let's just say as a real estate agent, I'm listing a property on behalf of a seller. I am a seller's agent. And because obviously that property is listed on the multiple listing service and is syndicated to sites that the public sees, such as Zillow, Trulia, Realtor.com, Redfin.com, consumers will see those properties and often reach out to the person whose name they see listed next to that property, the listing agent. In that case, when that person reaches out, say to me as the listing agent, the person that's listing that property and acting on behalf of the seller, they are forming with me what's called a disclosed dual agent relationship, because they're reaching out to me potentially to represent them as the buyer. Now again, obviously, in order to represent them, I have to disclose to them that I'm working on behalf of the seller, and I have to disclose to the seller that I'm working with this buyer to show them their property. Now, it's important for me as a listing agent to make this clear to the buyer up front so that they have the opportunity to work with another buyer's agent if they choose to. It's also important for me to disclose that to the seller because, again, I'm representing the seller as a listing agent, and so they are, in this case, my priority, and I'm representing their interests first. Now, the fact is, in situations like this, if I'm the listing agent and someone calls me about a property that I'm listing, in that case, I may refer that buyer to either someone on my team or another person in my brokerage so that they can show the buyer the property, and then we can create a little bit of a buffer between me representing the seller and also that buyer and who's representing them, say if it's someone from my team or someone from my brokerage. Now, it's still disclosed to agency if two agents from the same brokerage are representing the seller and the buyer. So to summarize, disclosed to agency, I want to be as clear as possible and read you exactly what it says on our consumer information statement, just to summarize and just so it's clear, because disclosed to agency can be a bit tricky. It says a real estate licensee working as a disclosed to agent must carefully explain to each party that in addition to working as their agent, their firm will also work as the agent for the other party. They must also explain what effect their working as a disclosed to agent will have on the fiduciary duties their firm owes to the buyer and to the seller. When working as a disclosed to agent, a brokerage firm must have the express permission of a party prior to disclosing confidential information to the other party. Such information includes the highest price a buyer can afford to pay and the lowest price a seller will accept, and the party's motivation to buy or sell. So that's disclosed to an agent, and that kind of summarizes the responsibilities of an agent that's working both as a seller's agent and a buyer's agent in a transaction. And the last type of agency I want to discuss is what's called a transaction broker. A transaction broker is not commonly used, at least from what I see, but it's pretty straightforward and easy to understand. A transaction broker in a transaction does not represent the interests of either the seller nor the buyer. The transaction broker is more or less a neutral party that is managing a transaction. Just to give you an example of how this might look in real life, a transaction broker might be appointed by a court in the case where a piece of property is being probated and needs to be sold. An agent might work as a transaction broker to either to show the property or to manage the transaction, but not necessarily represent the interests of either the buyer or the seller. In this scenario, a court may want a transaction broker to manage the transaction just to be doubly sure that a property is being sold in a fair, honest, and neutral way. Again, the transaction broker is a manager of the transaction and communicates information equally with both sides to ensure that the transaction is being handled fairly and honestly. The goal of the transaction broker is to basically ensure that both parties reach a mutually acceptable agreement and cannot advise either party on how to gain an advantage in the transaction at the expense of the other party. Again, it's important for owners or sellers that are considering working with a transaction broker to ensure that the nature of the relationship is documented by an agreement so that all parties know their responsibilities and their duties. Now, just to wrap up, this consumer information statement that we use here in the state of New Jersey is not a contract. It's meant purely to disclose the nature of the relationships that we as real estate agents have with consumers. It's essentially for informational purposes only. So I hope you found this information useful and definitely hope it provided clarity to you on how we as real estate agents work with and for consumers in real estate transactions. Again, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and I will see you in the next video.